Hi, this is Maggie, and you're listening to Catholic versus Catholic.
So just tell us a little bit about yourself, if you would, please, who you are, what you believe, and how you came to believe it.
That's a huge question. I grew up in the Novus Ordo, and we did the round of church hopping, trying to find a more conservative parish, because every parish we went to would become increasingly liberal. And I don't know if it was just the bishop or it was just the nature of the beast or whatever, but we ended up kind of just throwing in the towel and being like, well, since it doesn't matter where you go anymore, we'll just go to the one closest to us. But we were very disillusioned. I was in public high school at the time. Between my junior and senior year of high school, we went to Mass, and they announced that they were going to have the new Eucharistic ministers. But they had this girl go prancing up to the altar in her go-go boots, short skirt, and midriff. And we're sitting there looking at it and going, no, you got to be kidding me. This is not going to happen. This teenager is going to give us God himself. So that was the last straw for us of all the things that we had to experience as a Novus Ordo. So we decided to look around and see what some options were. And my parents had remembered way back in, I think it was at the consecrations of Lefebvre in 88, that there was a Latin Mass in San Antonio. And they had gone, but then the excommunications of the society, when Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated the bishops and John Paul II excommunicated them, that scared them off, so they didn't continue going there. But at this point, it was kind of like, well, something's got to give. They couldn't be all wrong, considering how wrong this is. So we started going there through that entire year, and that was a huge eye-opener, of course, becoming traditional Catholic and realizing because before I was traditional Catholic, and you're in the Novus Ordo, it's like this fog. It's a cloud. Like, you don't know what sin is. I was teaching my catechism teacher how to say the Hail Mary. She didn't know how to say it. So this is a bit absurd. So going into the first sermon we had, I'll never forget, it was with Father Lease, and he gave this sermon on the merits and benefits and purpose and need for confession. And I just remember that whole week, in between the one Sunday and the next, I was freaking out. I was terrified. I die right now. I am going straight to hell. Because I hadn't had a good confession, like ever, because it was the Novus Ordo, and they just tell you, oh, it's not bad. You don't even know what you're supposed to confess, because you don't know what sin is. They don't make it clear that this is a sin, this is not a sin. This is a mortal sin, this is a venial sin. How do you know if it's a mortal sin? How do you know if you're in a state of grace? Can you know if you're in a state of grace? All those things you don't know when you're in the Novus Ordo. In general, perhaps that's gotten a little bit better when they've seen the attraction for traditionalism amongst so many of the faithful. I don't know. But anyway, the following Sunday, I was what the traditional priest calls, I was the big fish for that Sunday. Tied up his entire confession time, because I didn't realize I was doing what's called a general confession. I didn't realize that's what I was doing at the time. And all of us were just crying, because it's the feeling of that you've come home at last. So I ended up going to St. Mary's. I read a ton, just read so much about tradition, encyclicals by all the popes before Vatican II, learned so much about doctrine and about the church. And I read, too, the Society's arguments, why they can do what they do, their justification for it, so basically the supplied jurisdiction aspect, as well as their arguments against Sedevacantism. And it didn't completely satisfy, but it satisfied enough. So, and then I went to St. Mary's, and I ended up living in St. Mary's for a while, and I ended up dating somebody who was living there at the time. And unbeknownst to me, he was Sedevacantist, and he ended up moving, but shortly before we were going to date long distance. Shortly before he ended up moving, he dropped the bomb on me that he was Sedevacantist. And I said, oh, wait a minute. How can you be Sedevacantist? And because at the time, they were kind of like, well, it's a mass to go to, and they didn't think it mattered that much. And they don't think that way now, but they thought it at the time. But so my plan was to prove to him why Sedevacantism is wrong. So I researched it for an entire year, and both sides made logical sense. And then so it was a real dilemma. I said, well, if both sides can be right, then how am I to know which side is right? And especially because it affected, am I going to marry this man? Are we going to continue this relationship? Because at that point, we knew we wanted to get married. So I took it to the priest and I said, you know what? I'm going to leave this in the hands of God. I'm going to go to this priest and I'm going to tell him my situation and I'm going to let him handle it. I did not know this priest personally. He happened to be the rector of St. Mary's at the time, or the head of the academy. And then when we went to go have the appointment, he fobbed me off onto another priest. And I was like, okay, now I'm really thinking like, okay, whatever he says, because this wasn't even my personal choice of a priest. This was a priest that was assigned to me for the situation. I'm just going to go with it, hand of God. If he says no, then I'm going to break up with him and it's going to be over. So I talked to this priest. He was a German priest of the society that happened to be assigned to the U.S. Post. So I explained to him the situation and he said, so you don't know whether or not you can marry him? I said, yeah. And he said, don't worry about it. I was like, wait, what do you mean don't worry about it? He was like, this whole fight, this massive fight between this Sedevacantists and the society, more than anything, it's an American problem. It's like in Europe, not so much of a problem because we're all fighting on the same side, which is tradition. And I said, well, if that's my answer, I guess I'm going to go with it. So I did. And I ended up moving to the same place where my husband was. And there's a big chapel there. So he's a Sedevacantist. And they had a lot of people that thought that, she's converting for her spouse to get married, which was, I found that incredibly insulting, actually, because it's kind of like, well, no, that would be me selling out on my principles. I'd have to have some idea that there was some justification, some reasonable justification for what he believed in order to be able to marry him. And I continued my research and I figured out what the crux of the problem was that I had and why it was that both of them made sense. Because I said, you know what, it can't both make sense. And I figured out that the Society of St. Pius X and their justification for what they do is not reasonable and it's not logical and it doesn't make sense from the standpoint of what the church teaches. And I was committed to be Sedevacantist, and here I am.
Can you talk a little bit about your siblings and your parents, what their take was on your transition, and where did they go from there?
Well, the rest of my family is still society, excepting for one of my siblings who fell away from the faith. He left before we ended up becoming traditional.
So all the rest are in the SSPX?
Correct.
How has that shaped your relationship with them?
Oh, it certainly hasn't been easy. Tons of drama regarding my marriage, just tons. We were in St. Mary's. We were blasted from the pulpit. They were told point blank, you are not allowed to go. Nobody's allowed. So none of my friends were allowed to go. It was very much a blackballing by the Society of St. Pius X, the local people. And my best friend had to get permission from her priest to go to my wedding. So she was the only one I had there, my people, because my family refused to attend because of they see it as a different religion, even though we don't practice any differently. It's traditionalism, same as anything else. But
so in a nutshell, how would you characterize the essential differences between SSPX and Sedevacantist?
There's a couple of minor things, like technically they follow the 83 Code of Canon Law, which you'll get a lot of people in the society they're scandalized that anybody would be, you follow the 83 Code of Canon Law, you follow the 17 Code of Canon Law. But from the top down, you're supposed to be following the 83 Code of Canon Law. So you have people that do that and they say, well, so long as you're doing some other sacrifice, you don't have to do the fast on Fridays, and also you follow the calendar for the Novus Ordo. They don't follow the traditional calendar. Those are minor differences, but the biggest difference is the Pope issue.
Is the Pope issue best summarized as R&R, recognize and resist? That's what I've heard bandied around.
Yes, it'll be the recognize and resist position is the society position. So they're saying we recognize your authority, but we resist it. And they'll say well, our deciding line, our line in the sand is tradition. We go by what tradition says. The biggest problem with that, though, is that it makes them the arbiters of tradition. It's not vastly different from the Sedevacantist position, but at the same time, these people that are in recognize and resist will say, the church is done for. They'll say these things that are just, you can't say that about the church. The church is a perfect society. She is the bride of Christ. And they don't even realize, because they're so accustomed to having this duality of the good church and at the same time the bad church. Two different things within the same entity. And that doesn't work.
I always personally think of it as the baby in the bathwater. And if I get splashed with bathwater now and again, I just brush it off and continue focusing on the baby, which is Jesus Christ.
We call that the bad pope argument. And I understand it. Truly, I do. That's a vast difference, though. There's a distinction to be made between a defection from the faith and immorality. Those are two different matters.
I know the difference between being a sinner and being a heretic, but the open question in my mind is, can a pope be a material heretic or not? I prefer to think not. But there is evidence to support the notion that the church can correct a pope. And there is built into the definition of heretic the idea of obstinacy.
Right. No, that's the same argument that the society has, that, nobody can correct the pope.
No, I argue that we can correct the pope. How would you summarize the biggest heresies of Vatican II in a nutshell for me?
It would be the religious liberty. That's the biggest thing. Vatican II teaches freedom of religion, that people have an intrinsic right to determine their own religion, that they don't.
I have always known and understood and been taught by my church that indifferentism is a heresy and it's been condemned by the church. And then the Sedevacantists that I talk to say, oh, well, if you read Vatican II, it is in favor of religious indifferentism. But I don't believe the Sedevacantists, because I've never heard any Catholic, except for the Sedevacantists, saying that Vatican II teaches that indifferentism is the flavor of the month.
Oh, no, well, they don't call it indifferentism. They don't want to do something that, especially if it's already condemned, they're not going to want to do something where they can be called out for it that easily. They're not coming out and saying this sort of thing. It's in a confessional, and it's in the Amoris Laetitia. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Do what you want. Mother Teresa telling people that they don't need to convert because they can save their souls as Hindus and Buddhists.
If Mother Teresa is not a saint up in heaven, then I will have to leave Christianity.
Because if the Catholic Church is wrong, what else is there? Right? There's nothing else there. It proves God a liar. Right? That's the dilemma. I can understand that.
I will never abandon God. God's not a liar, but I will have to find a monotheism that is better than Catholicism. The Catholicism that I adhere to is so amazing and is so good that I can't even imagine a better form of monotheism. But if I abandon Jesus Christ, I will not settle for less than the Catholicism that I'm adhering to now, because the truth is better than any fantasy because of the nature of God and His goodness.
I completely admire your objective search for the truth and your commitment. But like so many, you're under the mistaken impression that if that's not it, then there's nothing there. They have the buildings, they have the money, the offices, they even have the titles, but they don't have the faith.
No, but they do have the faith. That's my point. There's nothing that any Sedevacantist has ever told me that makes me think that my church isn't traditional. My church is traditional. And if I think back to the Donatist heresy, do you remember that in like the 3rd, 4th centuries? There was Saint Cyprian, I believe it was, who said you can't have God for your father if you don't have the church for your mother. And I would take it one step further and say you can't have God for your father if you don't have the church for your mother. And you can't have the church for your mother if you don't have the Pope for your father. So that's why I would never become a Sedevacantist, because I want a Pope. I need a Pope. I would much rather kiss the feet of Pope Michael in Kansas than become a Sedevacantist, because I want a Pope.
Pope Michael is there because he started out Sedevacantist and he took it way too far. That is an admirable quality. It's a gravitational pull that we should have towards having a Pope. Absolutely. But you don't lose the faith. It's not like because, the Pope died and it's an interregnum, therefore you lose the faith.
How do you resolve doctrinal questions? And how do you confront heresy? If you're the one true church, how do you do that?
You go by the teaching of the church.
Because you mentioned earlier with the SSPX that they have made themselves the arbiters of tradition. So who are the arbiters of tradition in the Sedevacantist church?
Well, see, here's the difference, right? We're holding a line from Pius XII. It's like closing off a tap. We accept nothing after Pius XII.
Is there a living magisterium today?
No.
There's no living magisterium. That is so unappealing to me. I mean, I don't know why anyone joins you. I really don't. It's just unbelievable. Can you just explain to me why you're more happy being a Sedevacantist than you are being what you call a Novus Ordo?
I'm not happy to not have a pope, because that is abhorrent, or it should be abhorrent to any Catholic, because there is a belief in the papacy and a love for the papacy, but we do not believe that the church can teach error. The only way we can explain this contradiction is that he is not the pope. So when you ask me if I'm happier, of course not. I don't know any Sedevacantists that would say they're happy not have a pope.
But the Protestants are happy to not have a pope, and the Orthodox are happy to not have a pope. So this clearly distinguishes you from the Orthodox and the Protestants, right?
Right.
Even though I think there's a fair bit of private judgment involved in being a Sedevacantist, right? Because there are Sedevacantists that go further back than 1958. And the last pope for them was not Pius XII. There are different ways of drawing that line.
You're referring to like the old Catholics?
I don't even know what they're called. But one of my main arguments is I'd like to just wait 1 or 2 more centuries before I decide. I want the hindsight of history to reveal what is going on here and now in this messy situation with the Catholic Church, because I know from looking at the history of the Church that the people that were living in the complicated times and that were drawn to this heresy or that schism, they had the best of intentions. And if they had only stayed in the Church, they wouldn't be on the wrong side of history now.
Vatican II and the Novus Ordo is clearly departing and contradicting church teaching. It's a doctrinal difference.
What about the Donatists? Because they're a good example because they were hardline, sort of right-wing conservative types. The doctrine that they developed, which was in contradiction to the Catholic doctrine, was a new thing under consideration because they'd never undergone this before. It had to do with persecution and people that defect under pressure and that want to come back. And the Donatists took a hard line, and the church took a soft line, and they chose to separate themselves. But this is my point. The essential point is that they believed themselves to be the one true church. And this is why St. Cyprian wrote on the unity of the church, and why he said that if you don't have the church for your mother, you can't have God for your father. So it's very similar, I think, to the Sedevacantist position, where you think that you are the true church. You think that your hard line is more Catholic than the so-called Novus Order soft line.
The church didn't contradict itself, and they were resisting a contradiction. The church makes a ruling about something. It can't contradict itself.
But my point with my little thought experiment, where I'm just going to wait a couple more centuries to find out which way I'm going to go, and meanwhile I'll stay in the safety of the church, the point of that is that only time will tell if there was a genuine contradiction in Vatican II. And I'm not just going to take your word for it, but can you please tell me why I should consider the Mass that I went to today invalid?
Was it in English?
No, it was in French.
Okay. Well, so that would probably be my first problem with it, is that you're not using a dead language. Because using a living language, the words can change in their meaning, which is why the church has always used Latin, because it is unchanging in its meaning. So it's a way to protect from error.
When was the Latin Mass first said? Because it wasn't the Last Supper, I can tell you that much. The Last Supper was not in Latin. So how many centuries do you think it was between Jesus Christ instituting the Eucharist and the first Latin Mass?
I couldn't tell you that.
If it's so important that it be in Latin, you should know the answer to that question, I think. Does it matter to you?
No.
It doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't. And the reason why is because if the church decided that that was the best thing to do, then that's what the church decided. There is no doubting what the church has taught.
I don't doubt it, but I think that those who separate themselves from the church significantly doubt it. And I just want unity.
But the Novus Ordo isn't unified, right? So the unity of the church deals first and foremost with doctrine, because without doctrine, you have nothing. The Novus Ordo isn't unified in its own doctrine. I could go from one church to another church and it's different. I got one priest saying one thing and another priest saying a different thing. You got the bishops right now that are involved with trying to correct your pope on doctrinal issues.
Yeah, but there were, like I said with the Donatists, there were Donatist bishops, and there were Arian bishops, many. I think they outnumbered the Catholic bishops, actually. So there's a historical precedent for that, and we got through that, right? I mean, anything that the Sedevacantists can complain about since Vatican II or since 1958, I can complain about a similar story in history.
Not where you have a pope teaching heresy. That's never happened.
What is the heresy, though, that's being taught?
Freedom of religion, the heresies of Vatican II.
But like I told you, the only person that's ever taught me that indifferentism is acceptable in the Novus Ordo is a Sedevacantist. I'm not naive about the post-Vatican II world. That's the world that I entered straight from atheism. But I'm also not naive about the Arian heresy or the Donatist heresy or all these other things, or the medieval popes. But there's so much beauty in those that are adhering to the teachings of the church. Do you see what I mean? Do you see why I have hope?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You have the virtue of faith. That is a beautiful thing. And that's why, and he said it's like, because we consider the Novus Ordo a false religion, right? It's by virtue of faith, by that virtue of faith, that you'll save your soul. I just consider it a pit stop. That's what it was for me. It was a pit stop. I didn't, that entire time, I was so lost and confused and very close to losing my faith because I was ending up in the same dilemma that many other Catholics are in. How can this claim to be true? And yet we see the glorious, shining church. The church, it is indefectible. It is a glorious, shining thing. It's tragic, the number of souls that are being lost due to this false teaching. It is so rare for people to have the tenacity and the focus and dedication at all costs to that commitment for truth. No matter what, come what may, no matter what, where the chips fell, no matter how they fall, I am going to find the truth. That does not happen. And it's immense grace from God, and I'm so glad that you cooperated with it. So many of the people that go to the Novus Ordo, sadly, are not going there because it's the right religion. They're going there because, A, it's in the blood, right? They're Irish, they're Mexican, or they've been Catholic, or they're French, whatever. They've been Catholic, they're raised Catholic. This is what you do. It's just what you do.
Okay. Yeah. You've already given me more than enough time, but I'm going to wrap things up. I always have a lot more to say, and I'm excited to talk about religion, right? But do you have any, like, for example, did you do the Montfortian consecration, or do you have any other specifically Marian devotions that are part of your regular devotions?
Rosary. Always the rosary.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, at this point we have 7 children, and one of them they're all 10 and under. So my life is pretty insane. I have to recommend Consecration to Mary, of course. It's a wonderful book. And I think St. Teresa of Avila, if you've ever had the chance to read her autobiography, very compelling. Mm-hmm. However, just the biggest thing would be the rosary. And
you avoid the luminous mysteries?
I do.
Even though they're legitimate meditations on the life of Jesus and Mary during those particular scenes that are portrayed?
I don't believe that the rosary needed to be improved upon. And like I said, we don't, anything after Vatican II, we don't abide by.
Okay. So thank you for your time. At the end of my interviews, I always ask my guests to just give a little message of hope. So what would you say to anyone that might be out there listening now?
I guess if I had to say one thing to somebody, it would be that they have to believe in their own intrinsic value, the value that they have an immortal soul, and that God wants them with him forever. John 3:16, he gave his only begotten Son for you individually, for me individually. He would have gone through the entire passion just for you. And if that doesn't give us hope of the goodness of God and how much he wants us with him, then I don't know what would.
you like your worldview, if you think it's swell. If you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.